All right, in this video for week one, this will be what I would call a rhetoric and writing lecture. So in other words, I'm going to really talk about some things you can do for your first essay assignment and just generally things that are going to help you with writing throughout the semester. So let's go ahead and get started um, with that. So the first question I want to ask is, and hopefully this doesn't mess up hopefully you'll be able to see this okay as I'm recording, but what is rhetoric? So, if you've been in my class before, I've asked this question before, but you might ask, is it when politicians might, or other people, advertisers, lots of people will try to manipulate our opinions, right? Not all politicians, not all advertisers, but some. Is that rhetoric? Is that something that would be considered rhetoric? Your best friend persuades you to go to college. I had that experience. I've shared that with students before. I certainly wasn't planning to go to college, and I had a friend who sort of, along with my mom, talked me into just giving it a try. Why not? You've done terrible in high school, but hey, who knows? And you know what? They were right. Was that persuasion, or maybe you had a similar experience where somebody talked you into taking that first college class? Maybe it was just last semester. Maybe you're new. But anyway, was that rhetoric? Or what is that? Because sometimes I think we have an idea of rhetoric as, it's a bad thing, or some people might have an idea that's a good thing. But what is it? Is it, you go into a store, you're not really intending to get anything, you're just looking around, but somebody convinces you just can't live without that X, Y, or Z, whatever that thing is. Is that salesperson convincing you? Is that rhetoric? A doctor urges you to eat a healthier diet. I had that experience not too long ago, and I don't know how well I've done, but I'm trying. But anyway, that is that rhetoric. Explaining to your supervisor why you need to change your work schedule. If you do that effectively and you get your point across and you're able to change your schedule and keep your job, is that rhetoric? So think about that. You may want to pause the video for just a second, and then I will just say, whatever your answer was, you are correct, because all those are examples, in my opinion, of rhetoric. And I'm following the definition that is given in our Harbrace Essentials textbook, which is our textbook for the class, and it's the purposeful and effective use of language. Both of those things. You have a reason to use language. You could have a reason to use language. You could be very ineffective, but I like the idea of purposeful and effective. So if you got either one of those or all of those you said were rhetoric, you're correct. Those are all examples of using language, I think, with a purpose. And then if you got it done, you got them convinced, or the person bought the thing, the person decided to go back to school, it was done effectively. All right. Why am I sharing a picture of myself in front of that? Is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks ago. Just because I wanted to share that picture. No, because this is to me like the temple of rhetoric. That's how I feel when I go to the link. And I'm very much somebody, I studied rhetoric. I'm very passionate about it. I think language and communication is so important. And the person on the statue just behind me, Abraham Lincoln, there's an inscription just behind him that sort of gives him credit for being a unifier and bringing our nation, keeping our nation together through the Civil War. And then just to my right side, I'm facing the camera there. There's one of my favorite speeches that's ever been written. It's the Gettysburg Address, and you've probably heard of that before. We're going to talk about that just for a moment. So that's why I shared the picture, because there I was standing right where the Gettysburg Address was not given there. Another famous speech we're going to talk about was given near there by Martin Luther King Jr. But let's look at the first one, which is the Gettysburg Address. And this is maybe Lincoln's most famous speech. Maybe his other most famous speech is on the other side, which would have been to my left in that picture behind me. Which is his second inaugural, when he was inaugurated as president the second time. But this one, the Gettysburg Address, is very brief. I believe it's 236 words or something like that. It's not a long speech. It's almost like a paragraph. And he followed somebody who was speaking, who spoke for almost 2 hours and was considered one of the great rhetoricians or speakers of his time. And the audience went crazy, I think, at that speech. Supposedly Lincoln just spoke for a couple of minutes after that, and people were like it was almost like an afterthought. That even happened. The story goes that they couldn't even get the camera set up. Back then, it was a very difficult thing to maybe take a picture compared to now. And by the time the camera was all set up, he was done. He'd sat down already. And I think they have a picture of Lincoln sitting down. It's like, oh, that was the speech? The other guy talked for 2 hours. But in that, you don't have to maybe say a lot to say a lot. And in that speech, he did some of these things. And these are all ideas that are coming from our textbook, Harbrace Essentials, around pages 1 to 4, early in the book. So we talked about this in English 88 if you've taken that class with me. But the idea that there was an opportunity. So for Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, he was asked to go out. They were dedicating a cemetery for soldiers, National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just a few months after there had been a terrible battle there, but the Union, the North, had won that battle, but lots and lots of losses. And so he was there to sort of commemorate, that new cemetery opening. He had an opportunity to address. He's also in the middle of a civil war, which was threatening to basically end the United States and divide us into two countries. And so he had that opportunity, if you want to call it, or challenge. And what do we know about the writer? Well, Lincoln obviously had a reputation. In some ways, it was, it's like any political figure. He had his enemies and he had his supporters. And so I think for some of his enemies, the fact that he just got up there and talked for 2 minutes, it was just basically like, oh, here's this dumb hick again. He doesn't know anything. And there were people, if you read the history, that really saw him as this guy. Illinois was very much a frontier still in the days when he was elected president. So at any rate, he's the writer. People knew about him. That's part of the situation. He wrote the speech, delivered the speech. Who's the audience? Well, there were lots of press. There were lots of people there, as you can imagine, for an historic event like that, where they're opening this new cemetery that's dedicated to soldiers during the Civil War, famous people, political figures, and so on. So he had an audience. But like most speeches that are given by politicians, whether back then or now, he had a wider audience because that speech was going to be printed in newspapers. People were going to quote it and so on. So he's talking to the country in the middle of a civil war. So those are three things you want to think about when you're writing, whatever it is you're writing for our class. Think about your opportunity. Now, where do you find out your opportunity? Well, look at the assignment. And the assignment's going to tell you, this is what I'm asking you to look at. We're going to be looking at a short story, Hills Like White Elephants, for this first essay. So look at that assignment very carefully. In fact, I'm going to ask you to analyze the assignment and get points for that, because I think it's so important that you look at that, before you actually start writing. So what's your problem? What are you addressing? What's your issue? Well, you're the writer, so it's a little different in this case. It's not like something, with Lincoln where it's a famous person standing up in front of a group of people. Who's your audience? Well, for our class, that's going to be easy, right? It's me. I'm going to be reading your paper, but then also it will be one or two students in the class. So think about your classmates and think about your instructor for now. For this assignment, that's mainly who the audience is going to be for this first one. All right. And there's other parts to the rhetorical situation. There's a purpose, right? Lincoln obviously had a purpose. Now he wanted to dedicate the cemetery, but was really his main purpose? When you look at the speech, you can see that his main purpose was he didn't want the United States to end, and he wanted to, quote unquote, preserve the Union, the union of the North and South states, which were much, of course, fewer states than now. A message, what examples and support to use to deliver. So just like you have a purpose, Lincoln had a purpose, Lincoln had a message he was trying to get across, and you'll have some message. Usually you're going to state that, and it's also part of what we might call stance or your opinion. You'll often state that with a thesis statement. And we'll be talking about that. I'm sure everybody's familiar with thesis statements, but we'll be talking about some of how you can make sure you have a good thesis statement for this first paper. And then context, what factors influence communication? So for Lincoln, there's a lot of talk that he was actually ill, that he might have had a case of smallpox that was just starting, and then he ended up recovering from that later. I don't know if that's a proven historical fact, but maybe he wasn't even feeling very well. Obviously, a lot of sadness, a lot of fear about the Civil War, all these things that are going on in his personal life too, which when you read about his life, you would know. But there's also just all the social stuff. He's right in the middle of the Civil War. Well, we're in the middle of all kinds of social changes right now, it seems like, too, with the pandemic going on. Maybe some of that does affect your writing. It all depends on what your topic is. For this first essay, it might not affect it so much, because we're really just going to analyze a little bit of piece of literature and state an opinion about that. But still, these are the parts of the rhetorical situation that are usually talked about. And you notice these I've highlighted because I think this opportunity, this audience, and then probably your message or your stance are the ones that are the most important. But they're all important as you write. So these are things that we're looking at a famous speech as an example of what Lincoln might have done. But it's the same thing, even though we're not necessarily addressing a crowd of thousands of people or the news media. We still want to have all these components and think about all these things, but especially what's your purpose? What point are you trying to get across? Who's going to be reading this? And what are you bringing in terms of your opinion? All right, here's the speech. It's so short, I thought I would just include it. It's only 2 slides, and I'll just quickly look at this. And I also included a link if you want to go listen to somebody who's a better voice actor than I am read this. So I won't read it here, but just a few things to highlight. He starts out only 87 years ago, 7 years ago. This country was basically started. It hasn't been that long, and now we're in the middle of a civil war, and maybe the country's not going to last. And he mentions that here we are on this battlefield. They were in Gettysburg, where the cemetery was being dedicated, and we're going to make this dedication, which he says it's a good idea that we would do that. Again, I'll let you guys read this later. There's a link if you click on, there should be a link here. But if not, you can certainly just Google Gettysburg Address and then, or look in YouTube, and you'll find lots of recordings. I like the one that's read by Jeff Daniels, which I think I included. If not, I will do that for our class. He also says, in a way that we really can't do anything or say anything very important. The people who already died, who gave their lives here, are the ones who really did something that's memorable. We're just going to say some words, and it's kind of almost putting himself down, making himself unimportant. And then, his words are inscribed on that monument in Washington, D.C. So they have lasted, but he's kind of being humble there. But he does say that we need to honor the dead and actually take increased devotion to finish the task at hand, which for him was finishing the Civil War, the North winning, the Union being preserved, and the end of slavery and all the things that were part of the opposition that was that had caused the war. So lots of complicated stuff going on in the context, and he makes this very simple speech, but if you read it carefully, you'll see it's packed full of lots and lots of meaning and purpose. He understands his rhetorical situation obviously very well and delivers that speech. So again, if this link, if that doesn't work, again, let me know, and I'll that may just be a link to the thing about Abraham Lincoln, but I think it's a link to the speech. I'll check on that for you guys. But it's nice to hear somebody actually read it. It says a lot, and that's the reason I'm including it here, because it's somebody who's very aware of rhetoric and uses it obviously very effectively. Another person who used language and rhetoric very effectively is Martin Luther King Jr. If you've been in my class before, I've mentioned this speech, and I know everybody's probably heard this, but I Have a Dream, that speech, which was given in 1963, also right there in the same spot, basically right on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, I think is where he spoke from. If not, it was down just a little bit at the Washington Monument around there, or the steps of the reflecting pool. But I think it was right in that area, if I remember right. So at any rate, the speech has the same components. Again, there's an opportunity. Martin Luther King is, he was a civil rights activist, obviously, during the March on Washington for Jobs that occurred in 1963. And he called for civil and economic rights and to end racism. So he's got this purpose. He's a well-known writer. His audience is the people in Washington, D.C., and it's also lots of people on TV and radio listening as he made that speech. Same thing. He has a purpose. He has a message, a stance that he takes, which is a thesis, which he believes, that that we will one day advance, and have racial equality in the U.S. And the context, of course, 1960s. There's a lot going on that time. This is also, these links I do think should work. So if you wanted to click on these, you could listen to the whole speech. It is a great speech as well. This is not a speech class. It's not a literature class, but we definitely draw on those things to help with our writing. So, and again, here's just a visual to show you the author, Martin Luther King Jr., his text, his speech he's giving. It's not a written text, although it was probably written down, but it's this verbal, the speech, which can also be called a text. And his purpose to demand racial equality, his audience, the setting here in Washington, D.C., but also the United States during the Civil Rights movement. All right, so that, again, that's a little bit about rhetoric, rhetorical situation. If you don't take anything else away from that, just think about when you're starting to write something, think about who's going to read it and what do you really want to say. And if you can just start with that, that's a pretty good beginning, I think, for your rhetorical situation. Just what do I want to get across? Who's going to be reading it? And how can I best either convince them or help them understand what I'm trying to say? Another thing I wanted to talk about in today's lecture is just a little bit about essay structure. And we've probably all written essays. I'm sure everybody has. And there's many ways to construct an essay. And I'm just going to share an old tried and true formula, which almost everybody I'm sure has done. And let me just stress this. I may repeat this many times during the class. I think it's great to learn patterns, but that doesn't mean you can't break the pattern. It's just like learning how to write a certain type of paragraph or a certain type of sentence. You can definitely go beyond that. But if you're struggling at all, pattern is a good thing to have to fall back on. If I'm really struggling to say something, sometimes it's good to think, okay, how am I going to introduce this? How am I going to support it? And how am I going to finish it? And So again, this is just one pattern, sometimes called the 5 paragraph essay. You definitely don't have to write this way, but once again, if you're struggling, it's great to me anyway to have some, I would think of it almost like training wheels, just to kind of steady things until I can work things out. You might even write an initial draft, like a rough draft, with this kind of simple format, and then break out of that a little bit in a second draft. But at any rate, there's lots of ways to do it, but let's look. This comes from the Hard Brace Essentials book around pages 25 to 29. So begin with, you want to provoke thought, we could call it, or get interest in your topic. So again, one way to do that is to ask a thought-provoking question. Is your pet an important part of your life? Maybe you're writing an essay about, pets and how they're, important in our lives. Provide a shocking or informative statistic. In 2016, 68% of Americans own at least one pet. Now, maybe that wouldn't be shocking to a lot of people, but to me, that seems a lot, really. Way more than half of the country. That's a lot of people. You think the U.S. is, 330 or 40 million people, and 68% of them have at least one pet, which means lots of people have many, many more. Use a relevant quote. Aldous Huxley once said to his dog, "Every man is Napoleon," which I think is a nice quote. I heard another person say, "I want to be the person my dog thinks I am," because it seems like our pets kind of look up to us. They depend on us, right? But these are 3 ways that you could introduce an essay. And again, this is going to be embedded in a paragraph, an intro paragraph or a paragraph or 2. And then somewhere after you've maybe gotten the attention, told a little bit about your topic, then you might state your thesis. And a thesis statement is basically just the Hard Brace Essentials book calls it an explicit, meaning very clear, very specific declaration. You're stating the overarching or the main idea of your paper. So explicit declaration of the overarching idea of your paper. I will not put that on a quiz, I promise. But the idea is that you have a subject that you're talking about. You have some opinion or position on that topic. And together, if you write that into one good sentence, one good complete sentence, which we're going to talk some this semester about what is a good complete sentence, you have a thesis, hopefully. And that's what we want to have somewhere in the introduction to your essay. Again, I would use one of those types, or we'll look at some other types of ways that you can introduce your paper, but and then state your thesis near the end of your introduction. And that could be at the very beginning of the first paragraph, if you want to set it up that way, or it could be a little further. There are different ways to do that, but it's good if you can forecast a little bit. In other words, let people know what your paper is going to be about from the beginning. So again, if it goes in the first paragraph, that's a great way to do it. Here's a couple of thesis statements. Now, let's think about which ones are debatable. So that's one of the main things. For an argumentative essay, which we're mainly going to be doing this semester, it's good to have a thesis statement that is debatable. In other words, a reasonable person could have a conversation or a disagreement about that. Both Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. were assassinated. So if you want to pause it and just sort of think about, is this yes or no? Is that debatable, or is that just a statement of fact? So, again, with each one of these, if you want to pause and just think, you can do that with your video, either however you want to do that. But so for question 1, I would say the answer is no. It's not debatable. Now, again, there are some wild conspiracy theories out there that Abraham Lincoln committed suicide or something like it wasn't even him. He disappeared. He was on a desert island, living his life, enjoying himself. No, I mean, those are, but historically historians would tend to agree. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. So those are facts. So not really debatable by logical, reasonable people. And so it would not be a good thesis statement. So number 1 is no. Number 2, more than anyone before or since, Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln moved the U.S. toward racial equality. Now, lots and lots of people would maybe agree with that statement, or might in some nuanced way agree with it, and some people might disagree with it. So that's a good thesis. Yes, and I didn't put my yes, no here, but right here. But yeah, that's a good thesis because it's something we could argue about. And that means you had something to prove. If you have something to prove, you have a good thesis statement. If there's nothing really to prove, if you can just go to Google and look it up and find it, or go into a book or something and find the answer, then it's not probably a good thesis. It's just a fact. Lin-Manuel Miranda won 4 Tony Awards for his musical Hamilton. Again, pause if you want to think about it, but no, that's not a good thesis statement. It's a statement of fact. Number 4, Lin-Manuel Miranda is a great role model for young people. Yeah, a lot of people might say, well, there's nothing to debate about that, but we could debate it. It's not really a fact. Just like the fact that he won the Tony Awards, we could go and find proof of that. Though Spider-Man No Way Home is entertaining, revealing the identity of Peter Parker was a bad idea. So somebody who doesn't like the fact that now Spider-Man's identity has been revealed in the most recent Spider-Man movie, yeah, that's a pretty good thesis, I think. Actually, I'm maybe not perfect, but at least it's debatable, right? Because somebody would say, no, no, it's great. It makes the story interesting. The fact that he's got to hide even more. The budget for the new Spider-Man movie was $200 million. Yes or no? That's true, at least according to Wikipedia when I looked it up this afternoon. So that is not a good thesis, number 6. Number 5 is, right, because it's debatable. So again, that's the idea with these. These are not perfect thesis statements by any measure, but they're pretty good because they have at least the ones that we said yes to have that debatable quality. And that means you would have something to prove, which means you would probably be able to write an essay on that topic potentially. All right, so in the body, that's where you actually do have to sort of prove what you've said in your thesis. And so what you want to do is, I would say at least 3 paragraphs to prove your point. So you said Spider-Man, identity should not have been revealed. That was a bad choice by the storytellers, by the writers. And in the body, you have to prove that, or you said Lin-Manuel Miranda is a great role model for young people, and you have to maybe give your 3 or 4 reasons and explain all that, why it's true. That's what we do in the body of the essay. And you use transitional words to make that more coherent, or transitional phrases. Maybe even as simple as saying, the first point is, and my second point, you can do it that simply. We'll talk about transitions more as we go on, but some way you want to kind of have some cohesion, meaning that the ideas flow, and transitions can really help that. But the body is usually the longest part of the essay, so it's you have a shorter paragraph at the beginning and the ending maybe. And again, this is looking at this what we call 5-paragraph essay structure: beginning, middle, end, intro, body, conclusion. It's one way of organizing your ideas. And finally, a conclusion. So you do want to finish as strong as possible. It doesn't mean everything's perfectly wrapped up, neatly bundled, or anything like that, but there are some things you can do that make the conclusion better. One of them would be just to explain the significance of your main point. Maybe you talked about something, but you didn't really ever say explicitly, and this is why I told this story, right? Especially that happens with a personal essay where you share maybe anecdotes from your own life, and at the end you have to explain sometimes what was the significance of all that. Why was that important to you that happened? And then you could explain the consequences. What will happen if the reader does agree with you or does not agree with you? Are there some consequences? So you're urging people to reuse, reduce, and recycle. What's going to happen if people don't do that? That's a current struggle we might be having. If you have a powerful point, this is again with the final point. If you have a powerful point not appearing in your body, you can use it to strengthen your conclusion. So maybe you had 3 points in your body and you want to add one more really powerful point. You can just add that point, and that can be your conclusion, that final point. So significance of your main idea or point, explaining the consequences, or a final point. These are 3 really good conclusion types. There's lots of other ways to do it, but I just want to share a few with you to get us started as you're going to be working on this first essay. Oops, and that is the end of my slides. So the essay assignment will be posted, and take a look at that and let me know if you have any questions. And again, for this week, we're just going to be doing an analysis. In other words, looking at the essay assignment and trying to understand it really clearly. So that'll also be posted in Blackboard as an assignment. The essay itself is not due until next week, which I believe is February 28th is when that one is due. So let me know if you have questions by email, and otherwise I will see you soon in another video or see you in office hours.